A few thoughts on interaction patterns, task-based learning, and scaffolding in ELT. Let's start with interaction patterns. There may be any number of reasons why interaction patterns would be interesting for us teachers in our classroom, but at least to put it right direct, one of the reasons would be so that all of our students are totally occupied all the time. So they're not sitting around and waiting for their turn. So if we are lecturing the students, if we're being teacher-centered, then basically all those students are just sitting there looking at us, unless they have something that they've been directed to do, like take notes about what we're saying, for instance, or to carry out some directions that we're giving to them. So some of the most trending interaction patterns are going to be things like mingle, where everyone's moving around in a classroom. Obviously, lecturing, whether it's the teacher or whether it's a student or a group who is doing some kind of presentation. There's also going to be pairs, there's going to be small groups, there's going to be more complex machines where one member of a group has a role and so do the others, and then each group has a role itself. And then these different interaction patterns have some kind of purpose about what we're trying to accomplish with our lesson. So if we're just trying to give them a bunch of facts, then maybe lecturing actually is the best. But if we're wanting to do something communicative, then maybe we want to do pairs. If we're going to do a project, maybe we want to have some kind of groups. But just to reiterate, the main point is that all the students are active all the time. They're all learning. So if one student is speaking, then the other student is taking notes about what that student said, or maybe they're drawing what that other student said. So as a segue into the next bit about tasks, is now the teacher isn't at the center necessarily anymore. So maybe the students are going to take some initiative and build some autonomy. Maybe they're going to play the audio again if they want to hear it again in a listening task. Maybe they can do the attendance themselves. Maybe they can operate the multimedia. So task-based learning is most associated in ELT with David Noonan. And he's produced quite a few books and articles and whatnot that we can check out. So a task is basically a job, it's a quest, a venture, it's a problem, an assignment, a mission. It's something that we're trying to accomplish, which is not finished. And then there's two ways to look at this task-based learning, which is, in one case, in a weak form, we're using these tasks to structure our language teaching almost coincidentally. And then in the strong form, basically we believe that language is essentially task-like. So in order to learn or acquire language, then the obvious way to do that, the natural way to do that, is going to be through carrying out language tasks. So this connects to the postmodern conception of language, which is that language is purposeful and that it's doing something. So especially we could think of Wittgenstein, who had his idea of language games, and that language is essentially a builder communicating with other builders. So there's any number of different task types. Predicting, making inductions, taking notes, making a map, categorizing things, doing role plays, practicing something, skimming, all kinds of listening tasks, brainstorming, doing a project, evaluating things, and on and on. But you could say what they all have in common is that there's usually some kind of a gap or a fuzziness or an ambiguity or some kind of absence or problem, which is what the point of the task is to accomplish that and fill that gap or clarify that ambiguity. So the everyday communicative form of that is when we negotiate for meaning with someone. We don't understand what they said, we checked it, we understood them properly, and then in the classroom we see more formal structured ways of doing that, like gap fill, where one student has half the information, the other has the other half, and they need to speak with each other, or where one has a drawing and they explain to the other student about their drawing, and another one is going to draw without seeing that other student's image. Before going on to scaffolding, a word of warning is that students are coming to class to have a teacher because they can't teach themselves. So some might say that task-based learning and communicative learning and student-centeredness are basically a continuation of neo-Marxism and political correctness in the classroom. So basically seeing the teacher as an oppressor who needs to be taken down and destroyed. On the other hand, there's going to be those who are going to say, as in attachment theory, like John Bowlby or Gordon Neufeld, who are going to say that students actually need leadership, or Earl Stevick in ELT, who say that the students, they need guidance and they need to be given some direction, otherwise they feel anxious, which then is going to interfere with their language learning, and they simply don't know what they need, and that's why the teacher is there to give direction. We live in reactionary times, so that applies to ELT as well. So the excesses in communicative teaching of the 70s, today there's a course correction as we move back towards more formal and teacher-centered ways of learning. And lastly, scaffolding. So scaffolding is the supporting structure that we put up to support a building that we're erecting. And then in education, or in ELT for us, that means that the learning that we lay down initially is going to support the learning that comes after. So to give a simple example, you're going to want to generally learn the alphabet, or at least word recognition, before you're able to read. So the naturalistic view is that listening comes first, and that's followed by speaking, and then reading, and then writing. So this idea of scaffolding comes out of the work of a guy named Brunner, and it's also associated with the fellow Lev Vygotsky, and he had his zone of proximal development, or ZPD, which means that a learner can acquire only so much in a day or in a program or a year, and that we want to make that into bite-sized chunks, and then we want to sequence or scaffold those pieces. So these three things, interaction patterns, tasks, and scaffolding, are all interconnected. So our tasks depend on the various interaction patterns that we choose to use. And then ideally, we're going to sequence our tasks or scaffold them so that prior learning supports subsequent learning.